What's up, y'all? Welcome to the video. Today we'll be continuing work on the Souls-like combat series with some work on the user interface. In the last video, we left off with our damage and health system set up, so now we can damage and kill enemies and they can do the same to us. For this video, we'll be visualizing that system by setting up the health bar UI for both the player HUD and the enemies. And with that said, let's get right into it. For this video, we're mainly going to be handling things in blueprints, but referencing values from our C++ code. The reason for this is because Unreal Engine has a very nice interface for setting up different widgets and integrating those with our different blueprints that we already have set up, so it makes the whole process a whole lot easier. So first, we're going to get started with our enemy health bars. If you go into our blueprints folder that we got right here, I'm going to make a new folder. I'm just call this a UI folder, so we can set all of our UI blueprints in here. If you right click and you go into user interface, we're going to create a widget blueprint. User widget. I'm just going to call this VP health bar. So now if we go right into here, you'll notice you'll have a empty space. First thing we're going to want to do is make a canvas panel so we can put different elements in there. We're going to add a progress bar. And this is what our enemy health bar is going to necessarily be. So if we stretch this out a little bit, and we can scale this a little bit later, but we're gonna then want to center this. If you go into anchors, you can choose what corner or maybe in the center that you want to anchor the UI widget element to. So if we anchor this to the center, it's going to change the relativity of the position X and Y. And so you'll see here, if I put this here, these values will change. So if I sent this to the center and then zero these out, it's going to set it relative to the center of the screen right there. And so we're going to take we're just gonna make this 300 so it's a little bit more even. And we're going to set this to -150 just so it's a little bit more directly centered with the screen. That should be 20. All right. So this is pretty much all it takes to set up the widget on the design side of things. You can change the color over here. We're just going to change this to like a red maybe because it is an enemy. You can change that or maybe mess with these other settings around here if you want to make it look prettier. But for this video, we're just going to stick with this simpler setup. Now, if you go from the designer section into the graphs section over here, you'll see now we can set up some functionality for our widget. And the first thing we're going to need is a reference to the owning actor so that when we are tracking the health, the widget knows whose health to track. And so if we go to the variables, we're going to add a new variable, just call this owning actor. And if we go set the variable type, we'll just set it to an actor and an object reference. We'll set that to public with the I here. If it's closed, private, it's public, it's open. I'll save that. Now if we go back to the designer section, we can now go and we're going to make a bind for the percentage. And when we do this, we're pretty much just setting how filled the health bar is. And so we're going to make this relative to the owning actor's health versus its max health. So if we pull out the owning actor right here, and we're going to get its combat component, class and combat component. We're going to want to make sure that it is valid. So if you pull this out, get is valid, note with the question mark here. Feed that into that. We can now get our health. So type in get health and get max health. And this is going to be looking for a value between 0 and 1. So if we divide these two, we'll get the percentage. So just divide this by the max. We'll now get the proper percentage, and now those two should be bound. Now, the last thing we're going to have to do here is we're going to actually have to set what this owning actor is when we're setting up the widget in our enemies. And so we're going to go do that real quick. So if you go into our AI, our characters, BP enemy. We're going to go and add a component, and we're going to set up a widget component. I'll just call this health bar. And if we go over here, we tell it to make it a health bar class. And then we can change this however we want. It's looking a little big, so I'll just set the size. That looks okay for now. And then if we go into the event graph, we're now going to want to take this widget reference and we're going to want to set the owning actor to this. So if we go into our event begin play, we're going to get our health bar. We're going to get the widget from that. We're going to cast that to a health bar class, or BP health bar. And we're going to set the owning actor to a reference of self. And straighten that up a little bit. Great. Now, if we go in, so now if we go and test that, you should see here, the enemies have health bars floating above them. And if you hit them, see we do have their health. And when it's at 0, they die. So now that we have some health bars set up for the enemies, we're going to now go and do pretty much the same thing for the player, but in the form of a HUD. So if we go back down into our UI folder, we're going to go here and make another widget blueprint. We're just going to call this BP Player HUD. Going to add a canvas panel. And we're going to add a progress bar, but this time we're going to put it up. We're going to anchor this to the top left. And I'm going to bring this out a little bit. We change the color of this to also be red because that's typically what color they choose for health. There's that. And now we're going to go and set up the binding for this. Except instead of trying to get a reference to an owning actor, we're just going to get a reference from the player and try to get a combat component from that. So if we go and get player character, get component by class. Do a validity check. And we should now be able to compare the current health to the max health, and we should have the same effect. Go and get our health. And now that should be properly bound. Now, when it comes to actually setting the player HUD, instead of actually going into our player character and trying to add a widget component to that, we're actually we're going to go to our event begin play, and we're going to instead create a widget. We're going to select the player HUD, and this time we're going to add it to the viewport so that it is stuck to screen space. And it behaves more like a heads-up display in that regard. So if we compile and save that, go and test it. We now have our health bar up here, and if we let one of the enemies hit us, and we can now take damage. Let them kill us. And when it gets to 0, we're dead. So there you have it. We now have a pretty bare bones setup for our different health bars so we can better indicate how close the player is to dying as well as the enemies we fight. That's going to be it for this video. In the next video, we'll get into setting up our target locking system so the player will be able to lock onto an enemy of their choosing during gameplay. Until then, I hope y'all have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.